My name is Sam. I'm 54 years old. I've been an electrician for 32 years. And on a Tuesday morning in March, I sat in a bank chair across from a woman named Maya, handed her my old debit card, and asked her to open a completely new account that only I could touch. She didn't blink. She didn't ask why. She just nodded like she'd heard this story 100 times before. And maybe she had. Because what I didn't tell Maya that morning, what I couldn't say out loud without my voice breaking, was that I had just spent the previous night sitting alone at the kitchen table with 18 months of bank statements spread out in front of me like a confession I hadn't written but somehow had to read. Every line was a punch. Every number was a reminder. Every transaction told me something I had been too afraid, too tired, too guilty to admit for 3 years straight. $38,700. Gone. Not in a market crash. Not in a medical emergency. Not in some catastrophic event I could point to and say, that's where it went. No. It went to sports bars at 11 o'clock on weeknights. It went to online betting platforms I'd never heard of. It went to a beach vacation in Destin, Florida, a vacation I was never invited to, never told about, and only discovered because the charge showed up on a statement I wasn't supposed to see. It went to sneakers that cost more than the work boots I'd worn for 10 years on job sites. It went to electronics, jewelry, cash advances, restaurant bills, resort bookings, rental cars, and every single transaction had been processed through the joint account I had been talked into opening with my wife 3 years earlier. My wife, the woman I married at 52 because I believed in second chances, and her son Kyle, the man who was 24 when he moved into my house, the house I bought a full decade before I ever met either of them, with a promise that it would only be temporary, just until he gets back on his feet. He was 27 now, still not on his feet, and I was sitting in a bank chair on a Tuesday morning, transferring my entire paycheck to an account that had only one name on it. Mine. Here's what I need you to understand before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you about the silence in the house when I turned that key in the lock, before I tell you about Linda standing in the middle of the living room with her arms crossed and her jaw so tight I could see the muscle jumping near her ear, before I tell you about Kyle shoving his phone in my face with a look on his face like I had robbed him. I need you to understand that this story isn't really about money. I know that sounds strange when I just told you $38,000 disappeared, but stay with me, because what happened in that house over the next 30 days, what happened over the next 6 months, changed something inside me that no dollar amount could ever measure. And if you've ever had someone you love treat your income like their personal budget, if you've ever worked yourself into physical pain to keep a household running while someone else spent like the money grew on trees, if you've ever heard the phrase, "we're a family," used as a reason why you shouldn't ask questions about your own finances, then this story is yours, too. My name is Sam, and 3 years ago, I made a mistake that almost cost me everything I had built. This is what it took to get it back. You need to know who I was at 52 before you can understand why I let it happen. I was a union electrician, 32 years on the job. Up at 5 in the morning, steel-toed boots on before the coffee finished brewing. Out the door before most of my neighbors had opened their eyes. I'd climbed ladders in summer heat that would make your lungs feel like leather. I'd crawled through attics in January with insulation sticking to my arms and the cold seeping through my jacket like the building itself was trying to push me out. I'd eaten lunch in my truck during snowstorms because stopping work cost money and money was the only thing I understood as permanent. My first marriage had ended 12 years before I met Linda. Patricia and I had been good together for a while. Then slowly, quietly, we hadn't been. No explosion. No dramatic betrayal. Just two people who had drifted so far apart that one day we looked across the dinner table and realized we were strangers who shared a mortgage. We sold the house, divided the savings carefully and fairly, and went our separate ways. I saw my kids, Marcus and Diane, every other weekend until they were in high school. Then every other weekend became dinners when they were in college. Then dinners became phone calls. Then phone calls became texts on birthdays. That's not bitterness. That's just the quiet mathematics of time. By the time I was 50, I was living alone in the house I'd bought with the proceeds from the divorce settlement plus 10 years of careful saving. 3 bedrooms, a decent yard, a garage with enough space to actually work in. I'd painted every room myself. I'd replaced the roof after a hailstorm with money I'd set aside specifically for home repairs Because I'd learned young that houses don't maintain themselves, and neither do savings accounts if you aren't paying attention. I was careful. I was steady. I wasn't rich, but I was solid in the way that men who've worked with their hands their whole lives tend to be solid. Not flashy, not fragile, just built to last. The loneliness, though, that was real. Marcus had moved to Denver. Diane was in Atlanta with her husband and their 2 kids I saw twice a year, if I was lucky. The house was quiet in a way that started to feel less like peace and more like absence. I'm not making excuses. I'm just telling you the truth about where I was when Linda came into my life, because the truth matters. You need to know that I wasn't a naive man. I wasn't someone who had never been hurt before. I wasn't somebody who didn't understand risk. I just wanted to feel like I had a family again. And Linda made me feel exactly that. At first, we met at a retirement party for a colleague of mine. She was there with a friend who worked in accounting at the same company. Linda was 49, recently divorced herself, bright-eyed in a way that didn't feel performed. Or at least, if it was performed, she was exceptionally good at it. She laughed easily. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She told me about her son Kyle with the kind of warmth that made me think, this is a real person, a genuine person, someone who loves deeply. We dated for 8 months. She was attentive and engaged. She cooked dinner on weekends. She remembered small things I'd mentioned in passing, that I preferred my coffee black, that I found it hard to sleep past 5 even on weekends, that I had a soft spot for old Western films. She showed up to one of Diane's rare visits and charmed my daughter so thoroughly that Diane called me afterward and said, "Dad, she's great. Don't mess this up." We got married on a Saturday in September. 60 people. Simple, genuine, nothing extravagant. Linda wore a cream dress. I wore a suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Kyle was there, standing in the back, looking slightly bored in the way that 24-year-old men sometimes look when the event in question doesn't center them. That should have told me something. Kyle had moved into my house 2 weeks before the wedding. Linda had framed it gently over dinner one night, her hand over mine, her voice soft and certain. "He's between apartments right now. You know how it is. The rental market is brutal. It would just be until he gets back on his feet." And then the part that I would replay over and over again in the years that followed. Family helps family. That's all this is. Family helps family. My own father had said those exact words to me when I was young. He'd worked double shifts at a steel plant to help my uncle get back on his feet after a bankruptcy. He'd done it without complaint. He'd done it because that's what people who love each other do. And I had absorbed that lesson so completely, so permanently, that when Linda used those same words on me at that dinner table, they didn't sound like a manipulation. They sounded like home. So Kyle moved in. And I told myself it was temporary. The first time Kyle asked to borrow money, it was $200. "Car repairs," he said. "I'll pay you back Friday." That Friday he had new shoes. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was $200. I told myself it would work itself out. The second time it was $300. Phone bill. The third time it was $400. Rent on an apartment he was supposedly about to move into. That apartment never materialized. The money never came back. And every time I'd bring it up, gently, carefully, the way you do when you're trying not to seem petty, but you also know that $400 is $400. Linda would place her hand on my arm and say the same 5 words. "He's trying, Daniel. He's trying." She called me Daniel when she wanted to redirect me. I noticed that, too, eventually. Those early months had a rhythm to them that felt functional even when it was starting to feel slightly off. I'd come home. I'd cook dinner if Linda was working late. I'd drive Kyle to interviews that never converted into jobs. I'd pay for groceries, utilities, cable, the full cable package, the one with every sports channel known to civilization, and Linda would handle the bills. It was her suggestion. She'd said it was simpler. She dealt with the finances. She knew the payment schedules. It would just reduce friction if my paycheck went directly into the joint account, and she handled everything from there. I remember the specific night she suggested it. I was rubbing ointment into my lower back after a particularly brutal shift, and I was genuinely, physically exhausted in the way that makes even sensible decisions feel like too much effort to scrutinize properly. I said yes. I signed the forms. And from that moment forward, my paycheck stopped being mine before I ever had a chance to touch it. I want you to really understand what happened over the next 3 years, because it didn't happen dramatically. There was no single moment where I woke up and thought, I am being systematically drained. It happened the way water damages a foundation. Invisibly, gradually, one small compromise at a time until the ground beneath you is so weakened that the whole structure is at risk of collapse before you've noticed a single crack in the wall. The first compromise was the joint account. The second was letting Linda handle the bills without showing me the statements. The third was accepting her explanations without pressing for evidence. The utilities were high this month. Kyle needed something for a job interview. I had some medical copays. Each explanation was plausible. Each one sounded reasonable in isolation. It was only when you lined them all up together and looked at them in sequence that a pattern emerged, and Linda was very careful to ensure I never had the opportunity to see them in sequence. When I asked about the growing credit card balance, she would do something I came to recognize as her signature move. She would remind me, gently, never aggressively, but firmly enough that the point landed, that I lived in her home, too. Not my home, her home. As if the mortgage in my name, the walls I had painted, the garage shelves I had built with my own hands and my own tools, somehow made it a shared asset, while the money I earned somehow made it a shared resource only in one direction. The television appeared one day while I was at work. An 80-inch screen mounted to the living room wall like a monument to someone else's priorities. Kyle said it was a clearance deal. 2 weeks later I saw the charge. Not clearance. Full price. Purchased at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning when I was on a job site 40 minutes away. The vacation was worse. Linda came to me one evening while I was reading in the living room and told me she needed a trip with Kyle. Just mother and son time. She said it softly, lovingly, with a slight undercurrent of guilt, as if she was almost sorry to leave me behind, as if she had genuinely considered inviting me and decided I needed the rest more than I needed the company. You've been working so hard, she said. You deserve some downtime. I stayed home. I worked overtime. I thought of it as a kind of gift I was giving them, a gesture of generosity, the kind of thing a man who believes in family does without keeping score. I found out about Destin through a photograph on Linda's social media. A beach picture. Kyle grinning in expensive sunglasses I had never seen before. Linda in a wide-brimmed hat, cocktail in hand. The kind of effortless vacation ease that I hadn't experienced in years because I was always working. The transaction appeared on the statement 3 weeks later. Resort booking, rental car, restaurant charges across 4 days. More than $2,000. When I brought it up, Linda turned it around with such precision and emotional fluency that I was left feeling like the unreasonable one. You make me feel like I'm stealing from you, she said, and her eyes filled with tears that I was still, at that point, interpreting as genuine. Do you even trust me, Sam? Is that what this is? And I had backed down. I had apologized. I had carried the guilt of having raised the question for days afterward, as though the crime was the noticing rather than the spending. That's the thing about this kind of manipulation that nobody talks about clearly enough. It doesn't just take your money. It takes your confidence in your own perceptions. By the time it's fully operational, you're questioning whether what you're seeing is real. You're asking yourself if maybe you're the problem. If maybe you're being too controlling. If maybe love really does mean giving without accounting. And the guilt of that doubt is its own kind of cage. I stayed in that cage for 3 years. Until the night my card was declined at a pharmacy. I want to be precise about this moment because it's the kind of moment that doesn't look like a turning point from the outside. It looks like a minor inconvenience, a glitch, an embarrassment at a register that resolves itself within a day and gets forgotten. Except this one didn't resolve itself. I had driven to the pharmacy on a Tuesday night to pick up medication for my back. Nothing elaborate. Something to help me get through the night without waking up at 2 in the morning with that deep, grinding ache that builds after years of physical work. My card was declined at the counter. I stood there for a moment with that particular, quiet humiliation of a declined transaction, and I told the pharmacist it must be a system error and I'd come back tomorrow. I drove home. Linda was in the living room. I'll fix it, she said when I mentioned the card. Probably a bank issue. I'll look at it tomorrow. Her voice was smooth. Her delivery was seamless. If I hadn't already been paying closer attention than she knew, I might have accepted it completely. But Kyle's phone was on the arm of the couch, and as I walked past it on my way to the kitchen, a notification appeared on the screen. A bank notification. A cash withdrawal notification. The timestamp was from 2:17 in the morning on the previous night. 2:17 in the morning. I didn't say anything. I went to bed. I lay there in the dark with the clock ticking on the nightstand, and I made a decision. Not an angry decision. Anger would have been easier, actually. Anger would have been loud and clean and would have resolved into an argument, and then a fragile peace, and then more of the same. This was something colder, something methodical. The next morning, I drove to the bank. I asked for 18 months of statements. I sat in a stiff plastic chair in a branch office, and I read every line. I've told you the number, but numbers on a page can feel abstract, so let me make it concrete for you. $38,700 is roughly what I earn in a year after taxes. $38,700 is what it costs to replace a roof, renovate a kitchen, and still have money left over. $38,700 is what my father earned across multiple years of double shifts at a steel plant to keep our family stable. And it had left my account, the one with my name on it, the one funded exclusively by my labor, my body, my 32 years of early mornings and cold truck cab lunches, across 18 months of transactions that included, but were not limited to, a beach resort in Destin that I have already told you about, multiple visits to sports bars at hours when I was either asleep or on a job site, 17 separate transactions to an online gambling platform, a jewelry purchase that cost $1,100 for jewelry I had never seen on Linda's wrists, an electronics store purchase for $1,400, multiple cash advances at ATMs between midnight and 3 in the morning, and a rental car for a weekend I had been told was a quick work trip. When I asked Maya, the bank representative who handled my account that morning, if I could open a new account, one that only I controlled, one that no one else could access or draw from, she didn't look surprised. She didn't ask for the backstory. She simply said, "Of course," in the quiet, professional tone of someone who had heard this before, and she pulled up the forms. I signed them. I transferred my paycheck routing to the new account. I left the old joint account with exactly enough to cover the outstanding utility charges for the current cycle. And then I drove home, and I turned the key in the lock, and the house was too quiet. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped through the door. Not because of anything I could specifically name, not a sound, not a visible change, but because there was an absence where there should have been ordinary noise. No television, no movement upstairs, no sounds from the kitchen, just a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that lives in rooms where people have been waiting and rehearsing. Linda was standing in the center of the living room with her arms crossed tight over her chest, and her jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping near her ear. She had positioned herself with the precision of someone who had thought about where to stand for maximum impact. Kyle was beside her, or rather near her, pacing back and forth with his phone gripped in his hand the way people grip things when they're trying to channel their anxiety into an object. They didn't let me close the door. "What did you do?" Linda's voice cracked across the room like something thrown. Not quite a shout. More like the sound a voice makes when it's fighting to stay controlled and losing. I almost fainted at the ATM, Sam. Kyle stepped toward me and held his phone 6 inches from my face. The screen showed the balance of the joint account. There was a number on it. A small number. Not the kind of number that explains months of expenses and cash advances and beach vacations. Just a small, honest, accurate number that reflected exactly what I had left behind when I transferred everything else away. "What did you do?" he repeated, and his voice had a different texture than Linda's. Less panic, more threat. I set my lunchbox down on the hallway table. Deliberately. Without hurrying. "I got a new card," I said. I moved my paycheck to it. The effect of those 11 words on those two people was something I had not quite anticipated, even though I had replayed this moment in my mind 100 times during the drive home. The color left Linda's face so completely and so suddenly that it was almost physically alarming, like watching something drain. Kyle's pacing stopped mid-step. His mouth opened and then stayed open with nothing coming out of it. For 5 full seconds, the only sound in the room was the wall clock I had hung there 15 years ago, before either of them had ever set foot in this house. Then everything came apart. "You can't just do that," Kyle said. "We have bills." "Our bills," Linda corrected, her eyes locked on my face and searching it with the intensity of someone looking for the crack that would let them back in. "We have obligations, Sam. You can't just—" "They're not our bills," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. There's a particular quality to a sentence spoken with genuine certainty that makes volume irrelevant. Those 4 words didn't need to be loud to land. Linda's mouth closed. Kyle's pacing resumed, but differently now. Not the pacing of someone who's angry and channeling it, but the pacing of someone who is recalculating. I closed the front door behind me. I walked to the kitchen because I needed water and because I had learned, over years of working in high-tension situations, that the person who moves with purpose controls the room. They followed me. Of course they did. You blindsided us, Linda said. She had shifted her positioning again, leaning against the counter now in a way that was meant to look casual but wasn't. If you were unhappy, you should have talked to me. I did talk to you, I said. Every time I asked about the credit cards. Every time I asked about the savings. Every time I asked why there was a cash withdrawal at 2 in the morning. Kyle's expression shifted. You were spying on me. It's my account, I replied. That one landed differently. Linda's face changed at the word my, in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how completely she had mentally reclassified my money as shared property over the course of 3 years. I thought about all the ways I had heard the word ours used in this house. Our account, our expenses, our financial situation. But the reality had always been simpler and more specific than that word implied. My paycheck, my house, my name on every document that mattered. You're going to ruin us, Kyle said, and there was something in his voice now that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but was some compound of both that I found deeply clarifying. I'm not ruining anything, I said. I'm just not funding it anymore. And then I told them what came next. I told them they had 30 days. I told them that if they wanted to stay, the arrangement would be different. $800 a month combined in rent. Their own food, their own utilities, their own financial decisions with their own financial resources, and not a single dollar of access to my accounts. Kyle called it insane. Linda called it cruel. Kyle said I would regret it. Linda said I was tearing the family apart. I said the family was already cracked. I had just stopped pretending I couldn't see it. I need to tell you about those 30 days because they didn't unfold the way people imagine confrontations do. There was no sustained screaming, no dramatic escalation, no single explosive moment that resolved everything. Instead, there were strategies. Careful, calculated, evolving strategies from 2 people who were very invested in reversing what I had done. The first strategy was reason. Kyle caught me in the driveway during the first week while I was unloading materials from my truck. His voice was calibrated at a frequency I'd never quite heard from him before, softer, almost conciliatory, as though he'd practiced it. He said he'd been applying for jobs. He said maybe they'd started off on the wrong foot. He said he understood I was upset. I told him I wasn't upset. I told him I was finished. He changed tactics immediately and told me Linda wasn't sleeping. He said she was scared. I said she didn't seem scared when the Destin Resort charges went through. He left the driveway without another word. The second strategy was guilt. Linda came to my bedroom door one evening. No makeup, her face carrying the kind of exhaustion that's either genuine or the most committed performance of genuine I'd ever witnessed. She sat on the edge of the bed and said she'd been thinking. She said maybe she'd pushed too hard. Maybe she'd relied on me too much. She reached for my hand and said marriage wasn't supposed to be transactional. I agreed. I said it wasn't supposed to be one-sided either. Then she made her real move. She asked if we could compromise. She said I could keep my paycheck, but would I help with the credit cards? Just until they caught up. There it was again. Not an apology. A negotiation. A new access point wearing the costume of reconciliation. I said no. She called me rigid. I said I was consistent. She said I was punishing them. I said I was stopping. She left the room. The third strategy was anger. Kyle came home in the third week, slammed the door, and told me I was unbelievable. Apparently, the credit card he'd been using had been cut off, not by me, but by the card company, because the balance had reached its limit and the minimum payments had stopped. He implied I had orchestrated this. I told him I hadn't. He called me a hero sarcastically. I said I was tired. He said I was going to end up alone. I told him I'd been alone for 3 years. That I'd been alone in a house full of people and noise and the sound of a television I didn't choose and footsteps at 2 in the morning and the constant background hum of other people's financial anxiety. He didn't respond to that. He went upstairs and I heard his door close. By week 4, there were boxes. The big television disappeared from the wall. Kyle had sold it. I found out later. The room looked larger without it. Linda started coming home later and later, avoiding the house the way people avoid spaces where they've lost something they can't get back. On the 27th day, I came into the kitchen and found Linda sitting at the table with a notepad covered in numbers. She looked up at me and said, flatly, without any performance at all, "We can't afford this house." "You couldn't," I said, "and let the difference between you and we do the work." She'd found an apartment. 2 bedrooms. "Small," she said. "Not ideal." "Realistic," I replied. On the 30th day, Kyle loaded the last box into his car without speaking to me. Linda stood in the doorway for a long moment. She said this didn't have to end this way. I said it didn't have to start the way it started either. She opened her mouth, closed it, and said she hoped I was happy. I thought about that for a moment. "Not yet," I told her, "but honest." She walked to the car. They pulled out of the driveway, and the house was mine again. I want to tell you about the first night, because nobody ever talks about what it actually feels like when the thing you've been holding together finally stops and you're allowed to set it down. It doesn't feel victorious. It doesn't feel like a celebration. It feels like standing in a room you've been in 10,000 times and suddenly noticing the actual dimensions of it, as though the walls have just moved back to where they were always supposed to be. I stood in the living room after the sun went down and I listened. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. The wall clock ticked. That was it. No television. No pacing. No muffled arguments. No footsteps at midnight. Just the ordinary sounds of a house being a house. I went to bed, and I didn't lock the bedroom door. I hadn't realized I'd been locking it. I lay there in the dark for a while, not sleeping, just breathing, and I noticed that my chest felt different. Not lighter exactly, just less compressed. Like something that had been pressing against my ribcage from the inside had finally exhaled. The next morning I made coffee and carried it to the front porch, and I sat there in the early light watching the oak tree in the yard cast its shadows across the grass. The yard needed work. The roses along the fence were overgrown. I'd let things go, not just the finances. When you're spending every unit of energy holding a structure together, you stop maintaining the details. You stop noticing the flickering light fixture in the kitchen because there's always something more urgent. You stop trimming the roses because there's always something louder demanding your attention. I spent that Saturday cleaning, and it sounds like nothing, and it was everything. I rearranged the living room. I took down the wall mount where the 80-inch television had hung, and I patched the holes in the drywall, and I painted over them, and you couldn't see where they'd been. I opened every window, even though it was still cool outside, and I let the air come through, and by afternoon the house smelled like itself again. Not like someone else's preferences. Like mine. On Sunday, I went to the hardware store and bought new light fixtures for the kitchen. The old ones had flickered for months, and every time I mentioned it, Linda had said it wasn't a priority. Funny, I thought while I was installing the new ones, how priorities clarify when the money is yours. 8 days after they left, my phone rang. Linda. I stared at her name for a long moment before I answered. I had run through various scenarios in my mind. The check-in, the guilt trip, the Kyle is really struggling opening, the softly framed request that would take 3 or 4 sentences to arrive at its actual destination. I had told myself I was prepared for all of them. "Hi." Her voice was smaller than usual, quieter, without the structural confidence it usually carried. "Hi," I said. She told me they'd moved in. It was tight. I said I was sure it was. Kyle's voice murmured something in the background. She said she'd been thinking. She said maybe they'd handled things badly. And then there it was. Earlier than I'd expected, actually. Not buried deep. Not wrapped in layers of setup. Just there. We were short on the security deposit. $2,000. I closed my eyes briefly. "You said you weren't calling about money," I said. "I'm not," she said quickly. "I'm asking for help." "That's the same thing." Her breathing changed. She said she thought after everything, I might reconsider. Reconsider the hard line, she called it. As though my refusal to fund her spending was a stance I had adopted out of stubbornness rather than out of the recognition that giving her that $2,000 would be the first compromise that reopened the door I had finally, after 3 years, managed to close. "I'm not your credit line," I said. A long silence. "You're my husband," she whispered. I said. "But you treated me like an ATM." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't think you'd actually follow through." "I know," I said. She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat on the porch for a long time after that call. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It doesn't sweep through you like a wave. It settles in slowly, The way light changes in a room as the afternoon moves toward evening, and you sit in it, and you let it be what it is without trying to force it into a different shape. I had loved Linda, or I had loved the person she had presented herself as in those first 8 months. And there was something real in that, even if the subsequent 3 years had hollowed it out. Grief is allowed to coexist with clarity. Clarity doesn't cancel what was once genuine, but it does cancel the obligation to keep paying for something that isn't there anymore. A week after Linda's call, a message arrived from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. I get it now, it said. I screwed up. I thought I could fix it before it blew up. I was wrong. I sat with that for a moment. It was more than I'd expected from Kyle. More self-aware. More direct. I found myself wanting it to be genuine. There's a part of you, I think, that always hopes the people who disappointed you might actually have the capacity to understand what they did. It would make the story neater. It would make the loss feel less like waste. Then the second message arrived. Any chance you'd co-sign something for me? Just until I get back on my feet. I put the phone down. There it was. The apology as setup. The acknowledgement as opener. The I understand what I did wrong as a first step in a sequence that ended in the same place they always ended. At my wallet. On my credit. I blocked the number. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just cleanly, with the same deliberate calm with which I had signed the forms at the bank. Because clarity, once you have it, is something you protect. It doesn't matter how the request is packaged. It doesn't matter how genuine the preceding sentences sound. When someone has shown you consistently who they are across 3 years of behavior, you owe it to yourself to believe them, even when they're performing growth. The Friday after Kyle's message, I went to the garage and I found my fishing rods. I hadn't touched them in years. Not since before Linda. Actually, before the joint account, before Kyle, before the house had been turned into a problem I was always in the middle of solving. I used to go out to the lake every summer, sometimes alone, sometimes with Marcus when he was still close enough to make the trip. There was something about the water that did something to my nervous system that nothing else quite replicated. Not work, not sleep, not even the satisfaction of completing a project correctly. The lake was different. The lake asked nothing from you. The lake had no expectations, no invoices, no grievances, no strategy. I loaded the rods into the truck the next morning. I drove out to the water before 7. The air was cool and clean in the way that air near water tends to be, carrying a kind of mineral clarity that is the opposite of the indoor air of a house, where people have been tense for a long time. I set up on the bank, cast the line out, and sat back. And nobody needed anything. Nobody was calculating my next paycheck. Nobody was crafting an explanation for a suspicious transaction. Nobody was rehearsing a new angle of approach. The line moved gently in the current. A bird called somewhere in the trees behind me. The water was the color of slate in the early light. I sat there for 4 hours. I didn't think about Linda. I didn't think about Kyle. I didn't think about the $38,000 or the 18 months of statements or the beach in Destin or the 80-inch television or the 2 in the morning cash withdrawals. I thought about my father, briefly. I thought about the way he used to smell of metal and work when he came home, and the way that smell had always meant to me, as a child, that things were going to be okay, that someone responsible was in the house, that the lights would stay on. I thought about the fact that I had been the one keeping the lights on, in every sense, for 3 years. And the lights had stayed on not because of my presence and my protection, but despite the active and consistent effort of the people I'd been protecting them for. That thought should have felt bitter. Instead, it felt clarifying. I cast the line again. Somewhere between the still water and the gentle pull of the current, I understood something I'd been circling for months without landing on. Freedom doesn't feel loud. There's a version of freedom in the movies that comes with a soundtrack and a rush of wind and some visible, dramatic transformation. The actual thing is quieter. The actual thing feels like sitting at a lake on a Friday morning with nobody making demands on you and realizing that you're not waiting for the next crisis. That there isn't one. That you have, finally, arranged your life such that you are its primary occupant and not its maintenance crew. Steady. That was the word for it. I drove home in the early afternoon, unloaded the gear, showered, and sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee and the particular satisfaction of someone who has spent a morning exactly as they intended. This was my life now, and it was mine. 6 months is not a long time in the measurement of a human life, but it can be an enormous distance in the interior landscape of a person who is actively rebuilding. By the time 6 months had passed, my house was different in ways that were both visible and invisible. The living room had been repainted a warm gray that I had chosen myself from a set of swatches I'd spread across the coffee table on a Saturday afternoon with no one to consult and no one to defer to. The old curtains that Linda had chosen, heavy, dark, room dampening, had been replaced with simple white ones that filled the room with morning light. The garden was alive again. The roses were blooming in a way they hadn't in years because they'd been receiving consistent attention rather than being perpetually deferred in favor of something more urgent. I had joined a Saturday morning coffee group at the hardware store. 8 or 9 men, mostly around my age, mostly tradesmen or former tradesmen, who convened at 7 in the morning before the store opened properly to drink mediocre coffee out of paper cups and argue about the right way to hang a door or whether synthetic decking was an abomination or an inevitability. I had not had friends like that, regular, unhurried, uncomplicated friends, in years. I was fishing twice a month. I had fixed the crack in the driveway I had been stepping over without addressing for so long that it had become invisible to me, which I now recognized as a metaphor, but tried not to dwell on too heavily. I was sleeping through the night. I had not locked my bedroom door since the day they left. On a Thursday evening in early autumn, I was in the garage sanding down a bookshelf I was building, not for any particular reason, not for anyone in particular, just because I wanted a bookshelf and I wanted to build it myself, when I heard a knock at the front door. I knew it was her before I opened it. I can't explain that. Maybe it was the quality of the knock, hesitant but not timid, the knock of someone who believes they still have a connection to the space behind the door even if they no longer have a key for it. Maybe it was something else. But I set the sandpaper down and walked through the house, and opened the door, and Linda was standing on the porch. She was different, thinner, dressed simply, jeans, a worn sweater, flat shoes. No expensive bag, no carefully constructed presentation. Just a woman standing on a porch looking tired in a way that looked real. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I said. I let her in. I don't entirely know why except that there was nothing in my chest that told me not to. No alarm. No defensive tightening, just a sort of calm recognition that this was a person I had once loved, standing in the doorway of a house we had once shared, and that the door didn't have to be a wall. She walked into the living room slowly, looking around the way people look at places they used to know when they're trying to reconcile memory with present reality. She noted the new paint, the new curtains, the absence of the television mount, the fresh drywall where it had been. "You changed it," she said softly. "I needed to," I replied. We sat across from each other on the same couch, where so many things had unraveled. She told me Kyle wasn't with her. She said they weren't together anymore. He'd left 2 months earlier. The debt, she said, was worse than she'd known. Gambling debts beyond what I'd found in the statements. Personal loans from people she hadn't been aware of. He had used her the same way they had used me, she said. That word again. Used. And this time she said it about herself without flinching, which told me something had genuinely shifted. She said she'd hit rock bottom. I sat with that. She said she was working 2 jobs, paying down what she could. She looked at me with eyes that weren't performing anything. No strategy, no angle, just the straight-on look of someone who has stopped trying to manage how they're perceived and is just being perceived. "I'm not here to ask for money," she said. "I'm here because I owe you something." I waited. "An apology," she said. The words sat between us in the quiet room. Not a negotiation opener. Not a prelude to a request. Just the word itself, placed there like something fragile. "I knew the numbers were bad," she said. "I knew Kyle was spending recklessly. I let it happen because I was afraid. Afraid of confrontation. Afraid of losing him. Afraid of being alone again." She paused. "I chose the easier path. I chose to keep using your paycheck instead of forcing him to face reality." She looked up at me. I justified it by telling myself we were married, that it was shared money, that you were strong enough to carry it. Her voice dropped. "I never asked if you should have to." I didn't say anything for a moment. Apologies are complicated things, as I told you before. They don't reverse transactions. They don't refund years. They don't restore the hours you spend on ladders in the heat earning money that someone else spent on a beach you weren't invited to. But they do something that isn't nothing. They acknowledge. They say, "I see what happened. I see what I did. I am not going to pretend otherwise." That matters. Not because it changes the past, but because it changes what the past means. There's a difference between being used by someone who understood what they were doing and being used by someone who couldn't see it clearly at the time. I'm not sure which is worse, actually, but the acknowledgement makes the story complete in a way that the alternative doesn't. I can't undo it, she continued. I can't give back what was taken, but I needed you to know that I see it now. I looked at her carefully. Do you understand? I asked slowly. Why I couldn't help you again? Yes. Do you understand why I couldn't compromise? Yes. She didn't hesitate. I do now. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about money. Not about blame or accounting or who owed what. We talked about rebuilding, the small, undramatic work of building a life back up from the point where you've genuinely acknowledged what went wrong. She talked about the apartment, about the 2 jobs, about the reality of starting over at 52. I talked about the house, the coffee group, the fishing, about sleep. When she stood to leave, she stopped at the door and turned back. You look lighter, she said. I am, I told her. She smiled faintly. I hope you find someone who appreciates that. I didn't answer because appreciation wasn't what I was looking for. I had stopped looking for someone to appreciate me the way you stop looking for something that was never actually what you needed in the first place. What I was looking for, what I had found, quietly, in 6 months of managed silence and intentional living, was something more fundamental. I was looking for my own life, and I had it back. Let me tell you some things I understand now that I did not understand at 52. On that September Saturday when I wore a suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion and believed in second chances. The first thing is this: financial control is not a romantic issue. I know that sounds unromantic. I know that love is supposed to transcend the transactional. But here's what I also know. Love without financial honesty is not love. It's leverage. When someone insists that money should be shared but information should not be, when someone responds to financial questions with emotional accusations, when someone uses the word family to justify access to resources they have not contributed to building, that is not partnership. That is extraction wearing partnership's coat. The second thing, the erosion of boundaries never happens all at once. This is the thing that I most wish someone had told me before I signed those forms and moved my paycheck into a joint account that I never meaningfully controlled again. Nobody comes to you on day 1 and says, I'm going to spend your income for the next 3 years while you watch. It comes in small offers, reasonable suggestions, temporary arrangements that solidify into permanent ones when you're not paying attention. Each individual step seems small. The cumulative distance is catastrophic. And by the time you can see the full distance, you're standing somewhere you never consciously chose to go. The third thing, guilt is not evidence. I cannot stress this enough. For 3 years, every time I raised a legitimate concern, it was converted into a question about my character. Did I trust her? Was I being too hard on Kyle? Was I making her feel like a criminal for buying groceries? The genius of this technique, if I can call it that without making it sound more deliberate than it may have been, is that it doesn't require lies. It just requires consistently redirecting the conversation from the factual to the emotional. And once you're in the emotional conversation, the factual one becomes very difficult to return to, because now you're talking about your relationship instead of your bank balance. And any further pressure on your part starts to look like an attack rather than an inquiry. The fourth thing, the people who tell you that boundaries are cruelty are very often the people who benefit from your lack of them. The fifth thing, and the most important, saying no to someone you love is not the same as stopping loving them. This is the confusion that kept me quiet for 3 years. I thought that holding on to my own resources meant I didn't value what we had. I thought that protecting my income meant I was prioritizing money over people. I thought that drawing a line meant I was the cold one, the calculated one, the one who had turned love into a ledger. But here's what I know now. After 6 months of sleeping through the night and fishing twice a month and sitting on my own porch with my own coffee in the morning light, love is not a resource. It is not a bank account. It does not require constant deposits in the form of financial sacrifice to stay real. Real love does not ask you to choose between caring for someone and caring for yourself. Real love does not require you to disappear in order to fund someone else's presence. I wasn't withholding love when I opened that new account. I was protecting what remained of myself. And protecting what remains of yourself is not selfishness. It is, in fact, the prerequisite for everything else. There is one more thing I want to tell you about, because it doesn't fit neatly into the chronology, but it matters more than almost everything else. About 2 months after Linda and Kyle moved out, I was sitting in the living room on a Sunday afternoon with a book I had been meaning to read for years and a cup of coffee that was still hot because there was no one making demands on my time, and I noticed something. I wasn't braced. In the years I had shared this house with Linda and Kyle, I had not been able to sit in a room without some part of me being on alert, waiting for the next conversation I'd need to navigate, waiting for the next explanation that didn't quite add up, waiting for the next request that I would either have to accommodate or refuse and suffer the emotional aftermath of refusing. I hadn't known how consistently braced I had been until the thing I'd been bracing against was no longer present. And in that Sunday afternoon quiet, with the book open on my lap and the coffee steaming in the light from the new curtains, I felt something that I had not felt in a very long time. Something that I am almost reluctant to name because it sounds so simple that it risks sounding trivial. I felt like I was in my own life, not managing someone else's, not subsidizing someone else's, not performing stability for an audience that was using the performance as cover for extraction. Just in my own life, present in it, occupying it, making choices in it that reflected who I actually was and what I actually wanted and what I had actually worked my whole life to build. That feeling is harder to achieve than any amount of money. It is rarer than most people realize. And it is the thing, not the bank account, not the $38,000, not the joint account or the new card or the 30-day ultimatum, that I had been fighting to get back. I want you to hold on to that, wherever you are in your own story. Whether you're in the middle of the erosion, still trying to convince yourself that the small compromises don't add up to something larger, or whether you've already lost something significant and you're sitting with the grief and the clarity of that recognition. The money can be rebuilt. The account can be reopened. The savings can be accumulated again, slowly, carefully, the way my father accumulated them across years of double shifts and the way I accumulated them across 3 decades of early mornings and cold lunches in truck cabs. But the life can only be recovered from the inside, and it starts with the decision to stop being afraid of your own silence. If you have read this far, I think you might know this story in a way that goes beyond the specific facts of my situation. I think some version of this, the slow erosion, the language of family weaponized against your own interests, the gradual abdication of financial autonomy in the name of partnership, the guilt of noticing, the longer guilt of not acting. I think some version of this is familiar to you. Maybe it wasn't a spouse. Maybe it was a sibling, a parent, an adult child, a business partner, a close friend. Maybe the amounts were different. Maybe the specifics looked nothing like mine. But the underlying architecture, the way someone you trusted leveraged your love for them against your own basic protections, that architecture is not unique to me. And I want to say something to you directly. You are not selfish for wanting to know where your money goes. You are not controlling for expecting that a financial partnership involves transparency. You are not cold for declining to co-sign, loan, contribute to, or fund something that has consistently been misused. You are not cruel for drawing a line. You are not destroying the relationship by protecting what you built. If protecting what you built destroys the relationship, then the relationship was built on your willingness to give without limit. And that is not a relationship. That is a dependency with a friendly name. The hardest thing I did was not go to the bank. It was not open the new account. It was not give the 30-day notice or sit through the 4 weeks of strategies or answer Linda's call and decline the request or block Kyle's number with its second message revealing that the first one was a setup. The hardest thing I did was believe, in those moments of doubt that come between 3 and 4 in the morning when the house is too quiet and the loss feels large, that I had made the right choice. That the discomfort of protecting myself was preferable to the comfort of continuing to sacrifice myself. That my life was worth insisting upon. That was the hardest thing. And I want you to know that the insisting gets easier. Not immediately. Not without grief. Not without the particular, complicated ache of a love that turned out to be structured around your compliance rather than your presence. But it gets easier. And on the other side of easier is steady. And steady, as I have learned, is enough. My name is Sam. I am 54 years old. I am a union electrician who has spent 32 years climbing ladders and crawling through attics and eating lunch in his truck and coming home to a house that is, finally, exactly what I need it to be. I fish twice a month. I drink coffee on the front porch on mornings when the light is coming through the oak tree and casting its moving shadows across the grass that I trim on my own schedule, because it is my grass and my schedule and my Saturday morning to spend however I choose. I have new kitchen fixtures that don't flicker. I have roses that are blooming again. I have a bookshelf I built myself from scratch in the garage on an evening with no demands on my time and no one calculating what my labor was worth in dollars they intended to spend. I talk to Marcus and Diane more than I used to. Not because I made a deliberate effort to reach out, but because when you are no longer consumed by the management of other people's crises, you find that you have space for the relationships that were always quietly there, waiting for you to have room for them. I am not angry. I want to be clear about that because I know that a story like mine can sound like it's made of anger, the righteous anger of a man who was wronged, the cleansing anger of someone who finally stood up for himself. But that's not what it feels like from the inside. From the inside, it feels like clarity, like the difference between trying to see through a dirty window and the same view through clean glass. The world hasn't changed. The visibility has. Linda and I are not friends. We are also not enemies. We are two people who shared a season of each other's lives and learned difficult things from it, and have moved on in different directions with, I hope, some of the same understanding about what not to do next time. Kyle is out there somewhere. I don't know where. I don't need to know. I know where I am. I am here, in my house, in my life, with my coffee and my fishing rods and my Saturday coffee group and my steadiness. I am not waiting for the next crisis. I am not braced. I am not checking the account every morning to see what's been extracted. I am not holding my breath. I am just here. And that is, as it turns out, everything. I spent 32 years learning how to work, how to show up, how to climb the ladder even when my knees hurt and the wind was cold and the job wasn't finished and there were 3 hours left before you could justify going home. I learned how to do that because my father showed me, and because the work demanded it, and because there is a pride in sustained, honest effort that doesn't come from anywhere else. What took me longer? What took me 3 years of incremental loss to fully understand is that working hard and protecting what the work produces are not the same skill. Working hard is about output. Protecting your output is about something else entirely. It's about knowing your own value, about understanding that the energy you spend and the hours you give and the body you wear down in service of your family's stability deserve to be directed by your own intentions rather than someone else's. It's about the difference between generosity and extraction. Generosity is a choice. It comes from abundance, not necessarily financial abundance, but the abundance of knowing that what you're giving is genuinely yours to give, that the giving is something you've chosen, that the person receiving it would respect your right to stop if you needed to. Extraction doesn't ask permission. Extraction doesn't acknowledge the source. Extraction takes, renames the taking as sharing, and then treats your objection to the naming as the problem. I was generous with Linda. Then I became a source. And the distance between those two things is the distance between a relationship and a transaction, even if only one party in the transaction is doing the accounting. I don't regret the marriage entirely. That's the nuanced truth that gets lost in stories like this, because the narrative logic of a story like this seems to demand that the conclusion be, it was all bad. I should never have done it. I was a fool. But that's not what I feel. I feel that I loved someone genuinely in the beginning. I feel that the first months were real. I feel that the version of Linda who sat on my porch 6 months later and offered an apology without a request attached was showing me something true about who she was underneath the strategies. People are not simply what they do in their worst moments, but they are also responsible for what they did, regardless of the complexity of who they are. Both things can be true at once. What I regret is the silence, the years of swallowed observations, the questions I didn't press, the explanations I accepted because pressing them would have meant conflict, and conflict felt like risk, and risk, at 52, felt like the possibility of being alone again. I regret mistaking my fear of solitude for a reason to compromise things that should not have been compromised. Because here is the final thing I want to tell you, and I want you to hear it as clearly as I can possibly say it. Solitude is not the same as loneliness. A quiet house in which you are the primary occupant of your own life is not the same as an empty house. A morning in which no one is making demands on your time is not the same as a morning in which you are overlooked. A bank account that reflects only your own spending is not a sign of isolation. It is a sign of clarity. I was lonely in a house full of people. I am solitary in an empty one. And solitary, as it turns out, is a gift I did not know I was waiting to give myself. If any part of this resonates, if any of this sounds familiar in a way that sits uncomfortably in your chest because you recognize the texture of it from your own experience, I want you to take one thing from this story and carry it with you. The discomfort you feel about drawing the line is not evidence that the line is wrong. It is evidence that the line is necessary. The most important boundaries in our lives are almost always the ones that feel hardest to enforce, not because they're cruel, but because the cost of enforcing them is immediate and visible, while the cost of not enforcing them accumulates slowly and invisibly until one day you're sitting in a bank chair at 9 in the morning reading 18 months of statements, and the number at the bottom is $38,700. Don't wait for the number to get that large. Don't wait for the card to be declined at a pharmacy before you ask to see the statements. Don't wait for the silence after the confrontation to discover that you were missing it all along. Ask the questions now. Read the statements now. Have the conversation now. Not because conflict is easy or because the outcome is guaranteed or because the people on the other side of the conversation will respond with the maturity and honesty you deserve, but because you worked for what you have. You gave your body and your time and your skill and your early mornings and your cold lunches in your truck to produce the resources that keep your life running. That was not nothing. That was not something to be managed out of your own hands through a sequence of small, reasonable-sounding suggestions. That was yours. And so is the right to know where it goes. My name is Sam. I'm 54. I'm a union electrician. I fish twice a month. I sleep through the night. I drink my coffee on the porch in the morning light. And for the first time in a long time, I am living in a life that is actually mine. If this story hit you somewhere real, if you've had to draw a line that cost you something, or if you're still standing at the line trying to find the courage to draw it, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're protecting. Because the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. And you deserve to be free.